Hello and welcome to Policy and Politics with me, Tarun Nangia. Today's issue is very important for the trading community, manufacturers and even professionals seeking a job. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal met trade, commerce and economic ministers of several countries to discuss a free trade pact, which means that goods from these countries will be imported and we can export to them without paying any duty whatsoever, which means in effect zero duty. The meetings happened in Bangkok between September 8 and September 10 at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Gathering, also called the RCEP. Mr. Goyal held bilateral meetings with trade and commerce ministers of Japan, Singapore, China, Indonesia, Australia and Russia. The trade ministers of RCEP countries, which include 10 members, which are ASEAN countries, then India, China, South Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand, tried to give a final shape to the proposal of the Free Trade Pact, which includes several areas. It includes goods, services, investments, intellectual property and government. Today, we will discuss Mr. Piyush Goyal's visit to Bangkok for the RCEP meeting, whether India will join the RCEP and if yes, what will an RCEP mean for India, our country. I have with me former Commerce Secretary Rajiv Kher and Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, who was India's ambassador to the WTO. I would like to thank them for sparing their time to join us for this episode of Policy and Politics. Let us now start with our round of opening comments. Mr. Kher, can you lay down the ground for us with your opening comment?
Well, thank you so much. RCEP is a challenge to India. Much of the industry and business community is looking at it as a sort of an insurmountable challenge. Yes. They are perceiving it that way. But here is an opportunity which is staring at us. This also needs to be looked at in a much broader global context. The context of global economy slowing down, the context of India's economy itself slowing down and the Chinese economy slowing down, the fact of the trade conflicts between US and China, Brexit. So there is a general uncertainty in the global economic sphere. And I think there are a whole lot of threats, but there are a whole lot of opportunities staring at us. So RCEP is coming to us as a decision which needs to be made by the government, because in my perception, this is an opportunity for a reformative India. Okay. And I think that's what the importance is.
A short supplementary question would be, Mr. Piyush Goyal, when he was there negotiating with different member countries who are proposed to join the RCEP on a free trade pact, would he worry about China? Because we have a deficit of say $54 billion with China. Do you think that Mr. Piyush Goyal would be worried about this, because we would also have to give those zero rated duties on immediately on 25% of the goods, and will that affect us?
Well, I am not familiar with the nitty-gritty and the specific facts about how many lines and which lines.
Yes.
But yes, the minister has every reason to be a little worried about it, because as we know very well that China is our largest trading partner in the sense of after US. But the big issue here is the concerns about the trade deficit with China. So there are reasons to worry. But well, then there are, as we go along, there are also here opportunities for accessing Chinese market and the rest of the RCEP market.
Okay.
So his worries are justified to the extent that they should give us a resolve to come across these worries and create opportunities for ourselves.
Okay, that's a fair point. So as Mr. Kher says, Mr. Piyush Goyal, our Commerce Minister, has a reason to be worried with China, because we already have a $54 billion deficit. Of course, with other countries, there can be workings because we also export to other ASEAN countries. But I'll go to Ambassador Dasgupta. Sir, how would you look at this whole?
I agree with the views of Mr. Kher, but I would like to put a slightly different perspective on a few things. The first thing is that we already have a free trade agreement with ASEAN, which has been going on for quite a few years. We also have two agreements, free trade agreements with Korea and Japan.
Yes.
So that takes care of 12 countries. As far as New Zealand is concerned, our bilateral trade is less than $1.5 billion. So it is not very consequential at the moment, unless we give access to New Zealand in some things. As far as Australia is concerned, it is a major source of our raw materials like coal, for instance, some other products. So, we are not very worried about the surge of imports from Australia in industrial products, because Australia is not a major industrial products producer. As far as agriculture is concerned, Australia and New Zealand in dairy, in lamb, that is sheep, and in a few other products, they are quite competitive. Australia, for instance, in rice, wheat and sugar, they are very competitive, apart from dairy, and New Zealand, of course, is one of the best producers of dairy. So, these are some of the threats on the agriculture side. As far as Japan,
is genuine concern.
Yes, it is a genuine concern, but I will come to that in a moment. As far as Korea and Japan are concerned, we already have 2 FTAs with them, and of course, we are running a deficit of about $12 billion with regard to Korea. And with regard to Japan, it is it's about equal, slightly less. With Japan, it is less. Korea, it is slightly more. In fact, the figures that I have here, Korea is about $12 billion and Japan is about $8 billion. So, we do bring in a lot of intermediate products from and finished products, which are required for our own industry. And we should not forget that there are Japanese companies and Korean companies which are invested in India, in the auto sector, in many other sectors. And some of the components and the intermediate products which they require for churning out their finished products from India are brought in from their home countries, that is Japan and Korea.
Specifically to mention South Korea, sir, because if we see a lot of steel was being imported and still being imported from South Korea and Japan, which fuels a lot of Japanese car makers in India, despite we also making that good quality of steel. That was also a point, an issue between Indian manufacturers and the government, and they took it up around 1.5 years ago. But still that steel keeps on coming. So I think we have an understanding with those governments in that.
Perhaps we don't produce exactly the kind of steel which is required for their cars.
Okay.
And that is why we are still dependent.
Okay.
So there could be 2 reasons why we are still importing. Because one could be the quality of steel which they require,
yes,
the specifications.
Yeah.
Second could be the price. And if on either count the Japanese or the Korean imports are better,
yes,
the producers would be using that.
Okay. So as Ambassador Dasgupta said that Mr. Piyush Goyal would have also this at the back of his mind while meeting his New Zealand counterpart and the Australian counterpart, that these 2 nations are leading in the production of horticultural, agricultural products. Specifically, Ambassador Dasgupta mentioned about dairy products, and that would be on the back of his mind because India is largely dependent on dairy. We have a huge cooperative movement in India as far as dairy is concerned. There are private manufacturers also. That's an area with Australia agricultural products, if I may call it dumping, because there will be FTA, so there will be immense amounts of agricultural products coming in. I will go across to Ambassador Rajiv, to Mr. Rajiv Kher and get his opinion on the same. Worries for Mr. Piyush Goyal, what would he be worried about when he would meet the New Zealand and the Australian counterparts?
Well, as Jayant rightly said, New Zealand and Australia are essentially primary raw material countries.
Yes.
New Zealand on the agriculture side and dairy side, Australia on agriculture and whole lot of ores, minerals. So those are the real worries. But please remember that much of the raw material, I'm not talking of agriculture, much of the raw material is already coming at zero duty.
Okay.
Because it's a primary input to all our manufacturing activity.
Yes.
And that raw material is not available in India.
Okay.
Or we require more than what we can extract within the country. So, for example, coal. Now, coal is something we have in abundance.
We do.
But somehow, because of the mess in the coal sector, we have not been able to exploit Indian coal to the extent that we would like to. So, we are importing coal from Indonesia, South Africa, and elsewhere, Australia as well. So the point is that
unnecessary forex is going out of India. It shouldn't have.
Well, I think we need to take a slightly broader view. It's I won't say it's unnecessary. I'm talking in a general sense.
Yes.
Not specific to
yes.
coal. See, it's a value chain.
Yes.
If one country in the region manufactures a certain product or has extraction capabilities available,
yes.
and they are cheaper, and we are on the downstream of the value chain, we should be very happy to import that, because that gives us the competitiveness.
And secondly, if I may say so, there is a huge saying, and the reaction I get when I interact with the industry is that our coal of a very low calorific value. That is why also we import,
Well,
but this is the extent of my knowledge.
That could be. But I think that for a firm level decision making, what is important is where do they get their inputs cheap?
Yes.
Because that is what gives them a greater
So the industry will decide only on basis of
So
that.
industry will decide on the basis of that. So if I can get coal cheaper in Indonesia or Australia or these are the two major.
Yes.
So I would prefer to do that.
Okay. So Mr. Kher, based on your experience of this sector, specifically in commerce, I would like to understand that when our minister goes to the RCE meeting, what would be the 3-4 principal things that would bother him, in the sense that what to concede? For example, if we go ahead and sign the RCEP and China is in question, can we make China an exception and not extend those FTAs to China for specific goods where India will hurt badly? For example, there is a lot of, steel and aluminium that might come to India, specifically because China, being the largest producer of aluminium in the world, more than 54% of all aluminum produced in the world comes from China. Steel also, we actually had a safeguard duty put on steel, then minimum import price came into being. Is this exclusion possible?
Well, technically speaking, an exclusion is possible because you can negotiate. See, ultimately it's a commercial agreement.
Yes.
So the two parties to a contract can decide between themselves as to what they will trade, what they will not.
Yes.
But having said that, that's a question of in principle sort of a provision. Effectively, when you are signing an FTA, you are signing a large chunk of, according to the principles of your negotiations, you are actually submitting a large chunk available in terms of preferential trading arrangement. So what can be covered, what cannot be covered, this is all a subject of negotiations. Okay. But you asked me about the worries that the minister might be having on account of China being there. Well, the biggest worry that the minister would obviously is the gaping trade deficit. And clearly, if without an FTA there is a deficit, with an FTA, the apprehensions of the deficit widening are not.
So the apprehensions of the minister might be valid, completely valid.
Apprehensions of India vis-a-vis RCEP are valid.
Yes.
To the extent that we assume that India will continue to have a business as usual economic environment.
Okay.
But we are not sitting in a situation where we are looking at business as usual.
Okay.
We are looking at a reformative India.
Yes.
And therefore, there are a whole lot of opportunities here that should be triggered by a pact like RCEP. Now, my point has been that, see, an FTA is never negotiated in isolation. FTA is an instrumentality of economic policy which has to be positioned within your larger economic policy. Now, a trade agreement with such a huge bloc which has 30% of global trade, 45% of population and so on, clearly you have to go with a lot of action that you will have to take in the domestic context. So RCEP signing by itself without any domestic reforms, sorry, it's very, very avoidable.
Okay.
But RCEP with domestic reforms, which it will help in triggering, is something which is desirable.
Very informed and a firm view by Mr. Kher on this. RCEP without reforms not doable, but RCEP with domestic reforms will benefit India. If I may say so, just before Mr. Piyush Goyal, our Commerce Minister, went for the RCEP meeting in Bangkok, we also hear that the Prime Minister's office was briefed on this issue, which also shows that the PMO also is cued into these whole ongoings of the RCEP. We also hear that the following ministries, the Ministry of Steel, Agriculture, Chemicals, and executives of industries such as dairy, steel, copper, textiles, aluminium, engineering, pharmaceuticals, leather and food have expressed their opinion to the Commerce Ministry. Also these departments, various government departments also have given their inputs to the Commerce Ministry, based on which of course this would have gone into, Piyush Goyal would have gone into the meeting there. I'll take a short break at this point and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Just before the break, I mentioned that the following ministries from steel to leather to pharma, they have given their inputs to the Commerce Ministry. Also, the secretaries of various departments have given what's in their best interest, and based on that, of course, the Commerce Ministry would have taken its stance at the RCEP. I'll go across to Ambassador Dasgupta. Sir, last year we heard noises from China that India should make up its mind whether it wants to be a part of RCEP or no. Why is this? I mean, is there a kind of I don't know if it's the right word, bullying tactic to get India to sign it and come to a consensus fast? I mean, is it something like that?
I would say there is a lot of bluster and gamesmanship involved in this, because China has already got an FTA with the ASEAN 10.
Yes.
It has got FTAs with Australia and New Zealand.
Yes.
It is working out a trilateral FTA which has been put on hold for the moment with Korea and Japan. So it is only with India that it doesn't have an FTA.
Okay.
So without India joining this RCEP FTA, a lot of the sheen would be off, and a lot of the economic value would not be there for China. For ASEAN and Japan and Korea, they already have FTAs, so it is already there. So that is the first point. The second point is that you were talking just a while ago about India, not providing access to China for certain products.
Yes.
Now, if we consider that China is the uncertain factor because of its very large industrial base and diversified industrial base, and its the problem about its subsidies. Now, China, for ASEAN, we already have provided market access to, depending on the country, it varies from about 45% for one country to about 80%. And for Japan and Korea also, it is around 70 to 75%. They have provided us with more market access in terms of lines and trade. But our exports to both Japan and Korea are in the range of $4 or $5 billion per annum. Okay. So it is not very much. Now, the problem is with China because of the uncertainties involved, and because China is facing a huge problem with regard to its exports to the US,
yes,
which may continue for another 1 year or possibly for another 5 years, nobody knows.
Yes.
And it can then, if it gets the Indian market, substantial part of it, then it could arrange its own industry to exploit those tariff lines where we
India
provide
should be
access.
very mindful of that.
So that is an uncertainty factor.
Okay.
Now, as far as the others are concerned, if you leave aside China for the moment, what we are doing with the others is buying a lot of intermediate products, capital goods, for instance, from Japan and Korea.
Yes.
Agricultural products a little bit from Australia, but a lot of coal and mineral ores from other countries.
I would like to
Australia.
point out
Yes.
that specifically between 2004 and 14, India's capital imports bill almost rivaled our oil import bill, and that affected the economy in a sense. But Mr. Kher would be able to explain this better. Is capital good imports a worry for India?
See, capital goods import is a worry and a thing to be satisfied with, both, because import of capital goods only shows that there is industrial activity within the country.
Okay.
And therefore it's positive.
Okay.
Imports of capital goods also means that you are not producing the right kind of capital goods that are required for your economy.
Yes.
And because your industry doesn't feel competitive enough.
Yes.
So now, see, you cannot take an isolated view about any sector.
Okay.
When you are signing an FTA, you have to take a very comprehensive view. You will have to lose some sectors. You will have to gain some sectors.
Yes.
You will definitely gain some sectors. It can't happen that an economy of our size will not be able to gain in any significant sector.
One small caveat, sir. When our minister would go there, would this be at the back of his mind that India is a services giant that accounts and not a manufacturing giant in that sense?
I won't say that this will be his determining or rather guiding factor.
Okay.
But he will definitely have, because this is an important factor. But the focus on reviving manufacturing in this country,
Yes.
I think that rationalizes an approach which is which are those sectors where we have the potential of reviving manufacturing.
Okay.
Which are those sectors which are sectors for future? Which are those sectors which can create employment?
Yes.
And therefore, when we talk with a trading partner, an international trading partner, then we will like to look at these 3 or 4 aspects as to how I can, through that trade deal, help in all of
Now,
them.
2 important statements. When Minister Piyush Goyal was there was a statement made by the Minister of Trade of Indonesia. He said that global trade tensions could derail a landmark regional agreement encompassing 16 countries including India, China and Australia if the deal is not struck by November. There is one more meeting going to happen in November and we have to decide. He also said that individual ministers found it difficult to find agreements among the 16 RCEP participating countries. One of them finds solutions that work for 1 or 2 countries with too many differences with the outlying majority, which means the final word on the negotiations is not out. Many countries have issues, not only India.
Absolutely.
And as far as I would also like to read out a statement from the Australian agriculture minister. He also said that agriculture is a sensitive issue, and he went on to also comment that, so I will read out the statement, I have just got it now. Australian Trade Minister Simon Birmingham said, agriculture is always a sensitive sector and we must be mindful of each other's sensitivities. However, he wanted all participating countries to recognize the value in opening up trade flows. Can you decode his statement for us?
Well, it's simple. See, agriculture, as we all know, in all economies, even those economies where the percentage of population is
Less.
quite much lesser than what would be in a developing country like India. But agriculture is sensitive because there are several dimensions to it. 1, this dimension of self-sufficiency. 2, dimension of a large number of relatively lesser endowed people in developing countries dependent on agriculture. And then agriculture being the primary economy, it affects, once agriculture is affected, it affects the whole lot of downstream economy. So there is every reason for recognizing the sensitivity of agriculture sector, but the sensitivities have different perspectives. Australian sensitivity would essentially come from its capability of being able to export to other countries.
Okay.
Indian sensitivity would come from the context of impact of the imports on India's agriculture.
Okay.
So we are on 2 sides of the spectrum.
Okay.
So the sensitivities will vary. But yes, agriculture will remain very sensitive in all negotiations.
Now, Ambassador Dasgupta, I want to understand from you, November there will be one more meeting in all probability. In these next 3 months, what kind of issues will Mr. Piyush Goyal have to deal with in these sectors specifically? If you could share with us, mainly steel, which is commodities, engineering, aluminium, pharma, leather and food. Will it be, is 3 months a very short time for India to make up its mind on the RCEP?
The way the RCEP is structured, there would be a kind of a differential treatment of the different partners.
Okay.
So we would give ASEAN whatever we have given to them plus something. So which will bring us to something like 90% coverage of tariff lines. For Japan, etc., it would be 80 or so, slightly more. For China, it is likely to be less. And China, it is likely to be also backloaded, which means that only about 25 to 30% of the lines will become zero from day one. And then there would be a long phase out period. It could be 15 years, 20 years, depending on the negotiations. And some of them would get to zero during that period of 15, 20. And the rest would get to zero at the end of the phase out period.
So I think it's going to be a very hectic 3 months for the minister.
It would be, but it also depends a lot on the kind of perception that the others have about India's flexibilities. Because if we want certain things from, for instance, China, because that is posing a big problem before India and before Indian industry as well, and agriculture. Now, China, for instance, there is an apprehension that they will start exporting in areas which hitherto they were not exporting in large volumes or quantities.
Yes, that is our worry.
That is also a worry, because the market in the US will get reduced gradually if the present stalemate continues. so they can divert their attention and they can start making those products.
That's a worry for our
That is a
Commerce
worry.
Minister and also our
That's right.
country. And also the secretaries of various departments will give their submissions to
And
the
the
Minister.
second thing is, because of the very opaque and non-transparent system that the Chinese maintain about subsidies, they can subsidize and they can dump items where their production cost may be the same as that of India.
But they still will,
they can
but
sell
they
it
can
at a
damage
more-
our industry.
That's right.
That's a very fair point. Sir, from your experience, if you can share with us, what are the next 3 months going to be for Minister Piyush Goyal, given the fact that the PMO is also now in the loop? You must be knowing better, but these decisions are political, also business, everything is intertwined, geopolitics is also a part of it. What are the next 3 months going to be for our minister?
Well, I think the most important thing that the minister needs to address is the domestic constituency.
Okay.
You know, there is this for the last several years. It's not just the RCEP, but it is also the general dimension of FTAs, which have caused a certain amount of restlessness amongst the industry. Some of it may be justified. A large part of it may not be. It is simply a self-defeating apprehension. You know, please don't forget that in 1991, we walked on a completely new path, and see where we have come. We joined the WTO in 1995, and see where we have come. So every time there has been a challenge, Indian industry has been able to face that challenge. Therefore, industry's perception of seeing the doomsday, I think, is completely misinformed. I think the minister's biggest task, in my opinion, is to bring this kind of a credibility to what the government is proposing to do before the constituency. And in order to do that, he has to do an immense amount of framework related work. You know, you have to, it's not just advocacy, it's education. Even today we see our FTAs are not adequately used because people are not aware, or sometimes the process to take advantage of FTA is so tortuous, so difficult that people ignore taking advantage of FTA. So therefore, while what our negotiators do is an altogether different thing and is an extremely important thing, but within the country we need 3 things to happen. One, doing advocacy with the industry. 2, getting the entire government on one platform. You mentioned about steel, pharmaceuticals, etc., etc. Today, and this has been, it's not today, it's been there for decades now. Each department has this tendency of looking only within itself, what I call a siloization. You cannot have a successful trade agreement unless each of these departments looks at that trade agreement as an opportunity or a threat, but an opportunity necessarily. So therefore, and this is not just the minister's task, it will be the entire governance architecture which will have to work towards this, because everybody will have to feel, okay, this is going to be my commitment and this is the way I have to improve the sector. I don't want to name specific sectors, but we know that there are a whole lot of reformative action which is pending. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we used to import 200 million worth of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. Today we import 1.5 billion worth of it.
That's the kind
we
of...
are just waiting for something to happen so that our capacities to produce active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are the basic components of a formulation, are produced in India.
Yes.
Now, so time is of essence. So while the Indonesian minister may be concerned about November deadline, all right, we are concerned about how soon we can put our act together.
Yes.
And that is what, in my view, RCEP gives us.
That's a very relevant point made by Mr. Rajiv Kher. We draw this show to the close at this point. So very relevant points raised today in the discussion, but more or less a very busy 3 months for our Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal in the next 3 months leading up to the next round of meetings of the RCEP. That's it for now. We'll revisit this issue just before Mr. Piyush Goyal goes for his next meeting. But I would like to thank Mr. Rajiv Kher and also Ambassador Jayan Dasgupta for sparing their time and joining us on today's discussion. Thank you viewers for tuning into this program. This is Tarun Nangia signing off for now. Thanks.